Hey, Ballard Church, so glad you decided to join us this Sunday. If you're brand new, my name is Lance and I'm the pastor here. And again, so glad you took a little bit of your time that is so valuable. You could be doing a ton of different things. You'd be watching so many different things, but instead you decided to carve out a little bit of time and tune in with us on a Sunday morning. Or I know a lot of you watch it during the week. Maybe you listen to it on a commute. I'm just so glad you carved a little bit of time to figure out maybe what God is trying to do in your life in this season. We've been working through a book that came out about 20 years ago called Purpose-Driven Life. And it came out by a guy named Rick Warren. It sold a ton of copies. And what I love about it is that it's a conversation that's still relevant today. Some things don't age well over 20 years, but this definitely has. And he really proposed 5 purposes that we kind of glean from the Bible, glean from Jesus' life, that if we get these 5 things as followers of Jesus, that our life will be better. So, as we get these things together, we can start to answer the questions like, what am I here for? Why am I here? What is God trying to do through my life? And by figuring out those questions, I think we can move forward. Whether you're a follower of Jesus and you're just trying to grow a little bit deeper, I think clarity on these is huge. Or you're just investigating this and you're just deciding, what is this Jesus thing all about? Is Ballard Church a cult? I'm not really sure. As you're exploring these a little bit more, I think you can gain clarity on your life and why we believe God wired you the same way you wired me, the same way you wired your parents, your friends, your ancestors, and all of humanity. One thing that we've kind of made very clear is that we each have our own unique personality, that we have our own personality that's very unique to you, but we all have the same purposes that are unique or really to humankind. They're really for all of us. They're common amidst us all. So first 3 weeks, we've kind of walked through, the first week we walked through worship, which is simply refocusing ourselves back on God, which helps us draw closer to Him. The second week, we worked through fellowship, the idea of being in community together. And when we do that well, when we get unity really nailed, it helps us really understand how to work through difficult times. And this week, we're going to talk through a principle that strengthens our faith, that really strengthens our faith. If you felt in this last year, maybe in your life, maybe in your walk with Jesus, like your faith can be wavering, then this is going to be a principle for you to dial in with. And the principle this week is called discipleship. Discipleship. Another church word for you. First it was worship, then it was fellowship, then discipleship. And discipleship, though it is a worship, or rather a Christian term, I think it does get disseminated into a lot of culture. Sometimes when you hear about leadership, you hear about the idea of discipleship or mentoring or life coaching. They can all be really similar. What discipleship is simply, from a Christian context, trying to get your life to look more like Jesus. Trying to get your life to look more like Jesus, to understand Him better and follow in His ways. And it can seem like a really daunting process. And to be honest, it is. Some people sell it as it's easy. You just lean into Jesus more. You just be more about church. And discipleship naturally happens. And in my life, that's just not the case. Discipleship is something you have to work towards. It's complicated. It gets messy. It has its ups and downs, its complications. But Jesus really did bring this interesting dynamic to the table when it comes to how we deal with discipleship. When he dealt with his disciples, he made this one declaration. It was interesting that Jesus, when you look at these 5 purposes, these aren't kind of do as I say, but not as I do type things that maybe we can get away with as parents, but Jesus modeled all 5 of these purposes. He often took time to worship and draw close to God. He took time and really devoted it to fellowship and discipleship. Man, he had his disciples. If you remember, he had 3 that were incredibly close to him, 12 that were kind of a ragtag bunch that followed him around everywhere, and then past that, a ton of disciples that would follow him from place to place. 12 of them, which he looked at as his close inner core disciples. And they were really people that he decided to invest his time, effort, and energy in. And when you look to the call of Jesus to his disciples, I think you get a lot of understanding of what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus, what it looks like to really lean into discipleship and figure out how to grow in your faith and strengthen your faith. It all starts with the first thing that Jesus proposed to the people he wanted to follow him closest. He would look at them, he walked up to them as a stranger and said, would you just follow me? Follow me. And so maybe to help boil down the idea of what discipleship can mean, it's simply the invitation to follow. It's the invitation to walk with him, to take his lead, to see where he's going and adjust accordingly even in our own life today. And it's interesting for me, it brings up the picture, I don't know if you guys remember, of an old overhead projector. Speaking of things that are 20 years old that don't age well, you remember an overhead projector where you would have your transparencies and you'd set it on, and essentially it was just a big light bulb underneath it, and you would put it on it and you'd try and turn it on. And if you made the mistake of like staring down the barrel when you turned that thing on, you were blind for like a week afterwards. But the brightest light, you'd put your transparency on top of it, it would go up to the neck of the projector, hit some mirrors, and then fire onto the wall behind you. And you'd have to set your thing up, you'd get it all set up, and once you turned it on, that it wasn't all it took. You had to fine tune and adjust the mirrors and get it adjusted, bring it up and down, and you had to kind of focus the image as you went. In my head, that's kind of the lifelong process of what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus. That even once the lights turn on and you realize, you know what, I'm in and I want all this, you don't really have it all figured out, and you start to fine tune your whole life to get clarity on what Jesus wants for you. You start to really focus in and dial in, and it's never quite perfect, but there's some moments where you take a big step in the right direction, and then sometimes you crank too far and you go the wrong way and the image gets blurry again. And as a follower of Jesus, I think we spend most of our life trying to get a clearer image of what Jesus has called us to, of what his kingdom on earth is going to be like. And we get a finer image of what heaven might be and what God's intentions are and his purposes are for our life. That process is discipleship. It's getting to know Jesus in a better way. And it can take some time and it can be confusing, but it's a process of following, which leads me to the Bible story that I want to walk through today in the book of Matthew. And it is Jesus' interaction with a guy named Matthew. It's easy. It's so straightforward on this one. And this story of when Jesus first invites Matthew to follow him is probably one of my favorite passages in the whole Bible. I know I say that most weeks, but most weeks I'm lying. This one really is one of my favorite passages in the Bible. And I absolutely love it. It's crystal clear, it's encouraging, and it just brings so much depth from this little bit of interaction to understand how Jesus wanted us to interact with people and really to interact with him. And so if you have a Bible, you can bust it out. If not, the verses are going to pop up on the screen and you can follow along that way. I would encourage you to take some notes along the way, maybe underline something if you got a Bible. It's not sacrilegious to bring a highlighter or underline it or write in the margins. I promise you it's not. You can do it. It'll help you remember things later on. But here's what we see in Matthew chapter 9, and we're going to start in verse 9. Matthew chapter 9, starting in verse 9, as we see Jesus starting to gather his disciples, or the people that he would closely disciple in his life. Here's what it says. As Jesus went from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at a tax collector's booth. That's important. You can circle a tax collector's booth. Jesus looked at him and he said, "Follow me." Matthew got up and he followed him. And maybe you've heard this story before, but just a little bit of context before we move forward. A tax collector in this day was seen as the bottom of the barrel, most notoriously terrible people on the scene. They were paid by the occupying Roman government to collect taxes from the people in the area. And oftentimes they just scraped a ton off the top, and they could kind of enforce whatever tax laws they wanted to, as long as most of it got back to Rome. And if people disagreed, they could throw them in jail. And they were really, what was interesting about it, they were Jewish people enforcing the rule of the Roman occupation, which, man, just talk about somebody who was on the outside of every relationship that they were in. They were often seen as greedy and manipulative. When people heard of them, they just got that nasty feeling. When you walked by somebody in their tax collector's booth, you just felt yucky. It's the same feeling that I get when I think of the scammer telemarketers who call elderly folk and get them to give up their entire inheritance because they believe there's some sort of fraud going on in their Social Security, and they convince them of all these things. They end up taking all their money, and you hear these heartbreaking stories of people who get scammed out of money. Like that nasty feeling that comes up when I say that person, that's kind of what people thought of when they thought of a tax collector. And so Matthew, there was no way escaping what his job was. It's not like Jesus caught him at the mall and he could be like, "Oh yeah, I don't know what I do for a living." He caught him in the act of tax collecting. And so Jesus looked at him, and I can only imagine the other disciples that were following him at the time were so confused by this interaction, because Jesus said, "Follow me." Just the other disciples said, "Where? Are we going to go beat him up on the outside of town? What are we going to do? Why would you want him To follow you, like, I don't want to be associated with him. There's no way I want to be a part of whatever he's a part of. This is no part to me. And what's interesting is that Jesus invites Matthew into relationship before he's done anything. He invites Matthew to follow him as one of his disciples before he's done anything in return, before he's changed his life. And if you're like me, a lot of times when you think about a relationship with Jesus, instead of saying simply follow me, you would have expected Jesus to say, if you were willing to blank, then you can follow me, right? If you were willing to quit doing this, you fill in the blank. If you were willing to stop this, were you willing to give this up, if you were willing to start doing this, if you were to read much of this, if you were to attend church X amount, then you can follow me. But Jesus didn't say that. Jesus didn't even say you had to quit your job. Jesus didn't even say you had to change your life. Jesus just looked at Matthew and said, would you follow me? Would you begin wherever you're at to follow me? That you don't have to change first, that I believe that change will happen over time. And it's so amazing to see what Jesus does. And maybe it's a question that we can ask ourselves if you are a follower of Jesus, to simply ask, where am I following? Where am I following? Instead of filling in a lot of the blanks that, am I reading enough? Am I doing enough? Am I following? Where am I following Jesus' lead? Can oftentimes be a great place to start. And so in the next scene, this is where things get even more exciting. Not only has Jesus invited a tax collector to be part of his posse, a phone scammer, a serial killer, whatever you want to say, fill in the blank of whatever's the most cringy to you. Jesus has invited him to be a part of his posse. It gets even juicier from here. This is where we crossfade on the movie, and the next scene starts in Matthew 9, verse 10. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, which is crazy. So Jesus said, follow me. Where are we going? Your house for dinner. It's crazy. Many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked the disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? Which is so funny to me. There's a couple of really interesting things that happen all at once right here. The first thing is that Jesus invited himself over to dinner, which is just like one of my favorite parts ever, where Jesus doesn't say, you know what, follow me. We're going to go take you to a mountaintop and shave your head. And you're going to take a vow of silence. You're going to become a monk now, and everything in your life is going to change. What Jesus does first is meets Matthew in the place of his most comfort, his own home, exactly where he's at. He's changed nothing. In fact, Jesus said, why don't you invite all of your friends over, which is the best distinction that the Bible makes, that there's tax collectors and sinners. Like, the sinners didn't even want to be associated as tax collectors. They're thinking, you know what, I may be messed up and terrible, but at least I'm not a tax collector. So the disciples were stressed out before to have one Matthew around. Now there's a group of them. They're all expected to be having dinner together. And wouldn't you know it, the religious leaders of the time, the people who were the priests, the perfect, they were running the temple, they were the people who were in charge of the religious system. They looked on and saw Jesus having dinner with these reprobates. And wouldn't you know it, they had an opinion. So they sneak off and ask the disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? To which the disciples probably thought, I don't know. Like, this is baffling to me. I can't figure this out. I have no idea why he's doing this. And maybe on the side, they're having this conversation of, you know, I don't know what we're doing here. I hope this is just one of those lessons that he teaches. Maybe he's going to pull off a miracle and he's going to turn them all into animals. Like, I don't even know what Jesus is going to do next. But the disciples and the religious leaders of the time are really confused by the actions of Jesus. And what this question invites me to do when the religious leaders ask, hey, what are you doing? This kind of concerned, skeptical, critical tone. It reminds me that sometimes when I don't have all the information, I need to stop being critical first and gather more information first, right? Like, sometimes when I walk onto a scenario and I go, this is curious. Like, I moved from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho to Seattle about 10 or 11 years ago. And I remember when I got to the city, I thought to myself, this is interesting. This is interesting. There's a lot of things that I walked away and go, well, that's curious. That is very different than how I grew up, man. This is a strange place from, I mean, you name it. It could have even been the 5-lane freeways. I was like, what is going on here? This is crazy. But there are so many moments that I would make assumptions before I had all the information. And it makes me think of this one commercial that it's stuck with me for years now. The marketing is just brilliant, but I think illustrates the point really well. Go ahead and check out this commercial.
Has a fractured fibula. Given him, well, Saturday. So I could be able to go on tomorrow.
Daddy's gonna be so excited.
All good.
That killed him.
Paging Dr. Palmer, Dr. Barbara Palmer. Dial 45.
Man, isn't that so funny? It always gets me because it's interesting when you don't have all the information. It's funny how you can be caught in a moment and feel like you have to explain yourself or feel like you're like, whoa, you don't understand the whole thing. And Jesus' response is so great amidst the criticism and skepticism and probably frustration and doubt and challenge that came from the people who were supposed to be closest to him and even the religious leaders of the time. Jesus' response is so telling. It says this as we continue in Matthew chapter 9. On hearing this, Jesus said, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. And it doesn't give us any context. It doesn't tell us if Jesus leaned over to his disciples and whispered, hey, it's not the healthy people who need a doctor. It's not for you guys. I'm really here for these sick folk. It doesn't say that he whispered. It says that he probably declared it. So amidst Matthew and all of his friends, he looks to the religious leaders and makes the declaration. It's not for the healthy that I'm here. And he might have even pointed. It's for the sick. It's for all these guys. It's all these guys. Could you imagine Jesus sitting at dinner? Can you imagine a friend sitting at dinner and be like, oh, I'm here for the sick, not the perfect. I'm here for that are kind of messed up, that don't quite have anything right. Could you imagine what the response is to the table? I mean, on one hand, you understand that it might be frustration, that people are like, whoa, you're in my home. You came to my house. I invited my friends, and you're going to use that kind of language? But my guess is this, if I'm being really honest, just knowing the tone that Jesus usually brought to the table, understanding his character through his teachings. I don't think Jesus was here to be sarcastic. I don't think he was being critical. I don't think he was making fun at their expense. I think he was making a comment that is both truthful and loving. A comment that the people at the table probably wouldn't have been surprised by. I don't think they would have looked around and be like, no, I'm perfect. What are you talking about? I think they would have understood and said, you know what? There is something inside of me that doesn't feel right. There is a side of me that doesn't feel like I'm quite getting it right. There's something in me that realizes that I don't even keep my own standards. And before maybe you get offended to think, hold on, Jesus looks at me as sick or broken or somehow messed up. Come on. Don't you feel that way sometimes anyway? If you did believe that there was a God, would you probably acknowledge that you haven't met his standards? Because if you're really honest, you don't even meet your own standards. If you wonder, like, man, doesn't the church feel so hypocritical? It's like, yeah, oftentimes we are. Oftentimes it's a challenge. Oftentimes we look at the choices and decisions that we make and we're not even proud of them. And there's those moments of tension where we're trying to do our best, but at the same time, we know we fall short. In this same tension moment that they felt, maybe instead of hearing the part about the sick, it's the part about bringing healing that caught their attention the most. It's the part that Jesus maybe were to offer a solution, that he could be this perfect balance between truth and love, the perfect balance between being really honest about how things lie and what things look like, and at the same time meet you in a loving and compassionate way. I think we've all met people who are either all truth or all love. And most of the time you lean one way or the other. I know I do. But you've met truth people before who are just like, I'm just being honest. Quit being so offended. It's like, well, no, you're just being offensive. It doesn't matter if it's honest. And you've met people over here that are just over the top loving, that just doesn't feel like they operate in reality anymore. It's like, hey, you've kind of lost track of, if everything's lovey-dovey, then we have some problems that we need to address. And what about the realities and the real hurts of the world and the real injustices and the real frustrations? Like, we can't just always be loving all the time. And Jesus was this perfect blend of truth and love, speaking truth to people, but meeting them in a place of hope and compassion and empathy. It was amazing. It was amazing to see. And what we see from here is this incredible statement that Jesus follows up as he really gives us a clearer picture of what it means to be a disciple. He says this after saying that I'm not here for the healthy, but for the sick. He goes on to say, but go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifices. He quotes the Old Testament to the people who should have been pros at it. For I have not come to call the righteous, but to call, and this is a word that we don't really like a lot, to call sinners. Jesus is saying he's not here to call people who feel like they have it all together. He's not here to call the people who act right, who know all the right things. He's not here to spend time in this holy little huddle of people who have their life together, because if Jesus really just wanted to hang out with the people who had everything right and had it all together, it was going to be a very, very small crowd. And the good news for you and the good news for me is that Jesus really wanted to invest his time in people who recognize that they don't have it perfect, but wanted to find a way towards purpose. That realize that, even internally, like my value structure has been violated by me. That the things that I strive to do, oftentimes I miss the mark on. And by realizing that, by really sitting with that, they got to this place where Jesus said, come on, I'm not here for the righteous. I'm not here for the people who are self-righteous, who believe they know it all and have it all together and act right all the time. I'm here for the people who want to admit and acknowledge that they don't have it perfect, but are looking to take steps in the right direction. Who are looking to begin to fine-tune their life to get clarity on what I'm doing in the world. That's the kind of people that I'm here for. And in the same vein, that's the type of church I hope we become. I hope we become a church that meets people exactly where they're at and doesn't immediately call them to this unrealistic standard, but first takes the time to understand, to sit with them, to go to their home and have dinner when that's an option again, but takes the time to sit with people and understand and really help people feel like they belong before they have to believe. That the first step in discipleship is following. And it may not be this big, drastic follow call that we think of. Like, if I give my life to Jesus, immediately he's going to call me to go do missions work around the world, or I'm going to have to quit everything and give everything up and live in a hut somewhere. That's kind of an unrealistic standard. I think what Jesus calls us to is to allow us to start following from exactly where we're at. And he meets us with truth and grace to walk us along this process. And the message today could have gone two directions. I think we could have gone through a ton of practical steps and what it looks like to follow Jesus with our life, or we could have talked about praying or reading our Bible or getting it. But I think there's plenty of avenues to do that. One of the ways that we provide is a thing called Growth Track, where we help people understand what it looks like to follow Jesus with your life, to know God, discover purpose, make a difference, and really just understand how to find freedom in your life. Like we have a Growth Track set up for that. You need to go to the website. You need to sign up for it. It's going to help you get involved in any way that you want to and take a next step in your life. But really, if I take a big back step, for those of us that have been trying to follow Jesus for a whole life, or maybe some people who are pretty new to the game, we need to step back and ask the question, am I still following? Am I still taking his lead and taking his cue? Because I believe your next step might look different than mine. It might look different than someone else watching. But the goal is to simply take a moment and listen to Jesus and wonder, where am I getting more clarity? Where am I following you more? What thing are you calling me to maybe set aside? What thing are you calling me to maybe pick up more? And just ask the question, am I following? And understand that he meets you with the grace exactly where you are. It says this in Hebrews 6. I thought this was so great. Let us go on and become mature in our understanding, as strong Christians ought to be. Help us become more mature in our understanding, because 10 years from now, I don't want to have the same faith that I have with Jesus today. 20 years from now, I hope to have a really different faith. I hope to see Jesus more clearly, and it's going to come through stumbling in the right direction, sometimes getting it wrong, but the reality is I hope I'm continually maturing in my faith. And I simply wrote it down this way: maturity is a means for ministry. Maturity is a means not just for self-validation and self-perfection, so I can be more like Jesus, so that's a really cool side product, but really, maturity is a means for ministry, that I can start to serve people, that the discipleship cycle and loop happens through me, that as I follow Jesus, I invite people to follow me as I follow Christ. It's something that Paul, a writer in the New Testament, really echoed this sentiment, that would you follow me, not just because I know where I'm going, but follow me as I follow Jesus. Follow me as I'm trying to go the right direction and move the right way. There's this challenging concept that I think if we look at the story of Matthew, we can understand a little bit better. But really, as people are asking the question, what's my purpose and what am I here for? And there has to be a solution to the pain that I'm feeling. I think the church can meet them in one of two ways. The Pharisees at the time, or the way that Jesus met Matthew. And it's interesting to see the difference. The Pharisees at the time said, change and you can join us. Well, Jesus said, join us and you will change. Isn't it interesting that if the Pharisees said, if you want to follow me, make some changes in your life. Quit your job, start moving forward, start understanding, memorize this, do this, make these sacrifices. Where Jesus said, I believe if you follow me, if you get in a relationship, your priorities are going to change. That if you engage in a real relationship, not just in a list of to-dos and to-don'ts, it's so much better than that. But if you engage in a real relationship, if you follow me, that you will start to change. And there's so much distinction in the process. There's a nuance to the two of them, but they really just mean such radically different things. And maybe you were told about a faith for a really long time that once you had your act together, you could jump in. But let me just tell you, that's not the faith that Jesus taught. Jesus taught about a special kind of faith, and it's a purpose. It's hardwired inside of you to get a better understanding and glimpse of what God is doing in this world, to really see him better. And all it takes is simply starting the process of following. To start the process of following. And as you follow, I promise you, over time, your heart will change as you get a better picture of what Jesus is doing, not only in this world, but in your life, what he's called you to uniquely. I think there's an amazing process that can take place. So I don't know what your next step is, but I would challenge you to pray, to look into it. Maybe it's joining a small group. Maybe it's just going through Growth Track. It's over Zoom. I promise you it's not threatening. We're not going to come to your house and shave your head and make you take a vow of silence. We're not going to do that kind of thing. But we're going to give you some truth and some love, and we're going to provide you some next steps in a similar way that I think Jesus did. That he would look to this community and say, you are welcome in this place, just as you are, hoping that years from now we can look back and say, wow, it's amazing to see what God has done in my life. So as we close this week and we head into another week of challenges and another week of moving forward, maybe that's a simple question that you can ask yourself. You can begin to routinely ponder, is where am I following Jesus? And maybe where have I started to walk my own way? Where have I started to follow something else in my life, whether it be a career or finance or aspirations or that kind of family or that kind of house? I don't know what it is for you, but maybe you've begun to wander in different directions and you could simply just refocus yourself, take a moment and say, Jesus, how can I start to see you better, see what you're doing in this world and see what you're doing in my life? I believe when we follow him, we'll begin to change. So let's take a moment and let's pray as we close today's service. Let's pray. God, thank you that you meet us exactly where we're at. That you don't walk away and say, hey, I'll check back in a week once you have your act together. That instead you meet us regardless of where we find ourselves. Maybe in the hardest seasons of our life. Maybe we feel like we're in a great place. But either way, God, you meet us exactly where we're at. You call us to get a better picture of who you are. We realize that sometimes this is going to take discipline. This is going to take action. This is going to be uncomfortable. But God, we choose to follow you wherever you lead. We're open-handed with our lives. We realize that as we follow you, we start to get a better picture of what you're doing in our lives and what our purpose is. So Jesus, be clear to reveal it to us. Thank you that you make it so abundantly available. In Jesus' name, amen and amen. Well, go ahead and join us next week as we continue on this series, Purpose Driven Life. We'll see you right back here at Ballard Church Online.